schizotypal for people who are kind of schizophrenic, paranoid personality for people who had paranoid delusions but didn't have the other problems that schizophrenics have. So it began to produce new categories, again, usually thought of as proper sets, to accommodate the fact that many people only had some of the features that defined a particular category. Second problem was a problem of combined expression. When people started diagnosing mental illness for real, something that they didn't really start doing until the early 20th century, they began having trouble sometimes distinguishing between schizophrenics and people with affective disorder. That's not supposed to happen. In the Bloilerian scheme of things, if you have the 4 A's, you're schizophrenic. If you have cognitive problems, you're schizophrenic. If you have problems in the emotional domain, you're a manic depressive. But it turned out that psychiatrists started encountering people who had lots of the features of schizophrenia, but also had lots of the features of affective disorder. What do you do in those circumstances? You come up with another category. And what they did was come up with a category of schizoaffective personality disorder for people who had the features of both schizophrenia and manic depressive illness. And then later on, early versions of borderline personality had the same kind of problem attached to it. In the earliest diagnoses, borderline personality disorders are people who were on the border between schizophrenia and manic depressive illness. That's different from the usage these days. And the third problem was simply instability. Some patient might have all the features of schizophrenia, and then later on, maybe 6 months later, not display too many of those features anymore. What do you call that person? You call that person not schizophrenic? Well, probably you should, but there was a big debate about that. So what do? Well, one approach was to opt for what we now recognize, it wasn't called this at the time, the dimensional view of the prototype view of classification. And we owe this to a late 19th, early 20th century psychologist named Wilhelm Wundt, who said, well, if you look at the classic fourfold typology, melancholics, phlegmatics, sanguines, and cholerics, he said, yeah, okay, there are lots of these people who aren't they don't really fit the classification of sanguine, but let's see what happens if we transform this fourfold typology into a two-dimensional scheme. And Wundt had the insight that we could classify people according to 2 dimensions. People who had very strong emotional states, whether happy or sad, versus people who had relatively weak emotional states. And the second dimension, whether their emotional states were very quick to change, or whether their emotional states were relatively slow to change. So we have melancholics who have very strong emotions, very strongly depressed or anxious, and once they get depressed or anxious, they tend to stay that way for a while. You have cholerics who are also highly emotional individuals, but they kind of go through bursts of emotion and then the emotion subsides very quickly. Sanguines, they're kind of easygoing, nothing really bothers them, they don't get too excited about anything, but when something sad happens, they get sad for a little while, and then they bounce back, and when something happy happens, they get happy for a little while, and they bounce back. And then these phlegmatics, they just don't do anything, okay? They don't respond to environmental events much, they just kind of go through life on cruise control. Wundt's insight was that we could solve the problems of partial and combined expression with respect to personality types by, instead of trying to slot people into one of 4 discrete categories, to locate people as points in some 2-dimensional space. So a classic melancholic, somebody who's anxious, worried, unhappy, suspicious, serious, and thoughtful, would lie somewhere out here in this 2-dimensional space. But somebody who was less of these things might lie somewhere in here. A person who was worried and unhappy and suspicious, but also hot-headed, histrionic, and active, might fall somewhere in this space, this vertical space. Somebody who is both unhappy and carefree, if you can imagine such a person, might be found somewhere in the center of the space. But Wundt's idea was, instead of trying to slot people into discrete categories, what we should do is classify them according to continuous dimensions. Wundt thought you could do that with 2 dimensions. If you think about the big 5 personality traits, you can think about that as a 5-dimensional scheme. Again, the point is that you can accommodate people, you can identify people as distinct from each other by locating them at different points in this multidimensional space. So again, we now recognize this as a dimensional version of the prototype view of classification. It's something that gets away from discrete categories and singly necessary and jointly sufficient defining characteristics. Okay, so here your category instances are going to be clustered in quadrants. People who are more or less melancholic are going to be found up here in the upper left. People who are more or less sanguine are going to be found down here in the lower right. So that gives us a way of thinking about prototypes. The prototypical melancholic is going to be somebody who falls kind of out here at about 10 o'clock or so, right? The prototypical choleric is going to be out here somewhere about 1:30 or so, 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock. And that's going to be the typical sanguine, but not all sanguine people are going to look like that, okay? That's the general idea, typical choleric. Okay, so that was one way of thinking about this. Wundt's solution was immediately adopted, and it's really from Wundt that we get this entire major tradition in personality research of assessing people's personality traits as continuous dimensions, and the bell curve and the normal distribution and personality testing and all of that falls basically out of Wundt's solution to the problem of partial and combined expression. Another variant, much more recent, occurred when institutional psychiatry adopted what we now recognize as the featural version of the prototype view for making psychiatric diagnoses. So remember, when Bloiler first described schizophrenia, he said all schizophrenics have these 4 symptoms in common: associative disturbance, anhedonia, autism, and ambivalence, and that created these problems of partial and combined expression that I talked about before. We know anybody who spent any time in a mental hospital, whether as a patient or as a worker, knows that all people with schizophrenia don't look alike. Okay, they have lots of different kinds of symptoms. And the American Psychiatric Association, in later editions of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, which is the psychiatrist's Bible in America, it's what we use to diagnose mental illness, essentially adopted the Roschian prototype view of classification. Look how the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, whether it's DSM-4 or the DSM-5 that just came out, does it the same way, classifies people with schizophrenia. You can be diagnosed with schizophrenia if you have either package 1 of symptoms, or package 2 of symptoms, or a package 3 of symptoms, and you display these for at least 1 week. So you can be diagnosed with schizophrenia if you have delusions and incoherence. You can be diagnosed with schizophrenia if you have flat or inappropriate affect and hallucinations. You can be diagnosed with schizophrenia if you've got bizarre delusions, even if you're not incoherent or you don't hallucinate. You can be diagnosed with schizophrenia if you have hallucinations, even if you don't have delusions or inappropriate affect. This is essentially what the prototype view is all about. The prototypical schizophrenic, the typical schizophrenic, has these kinds of symptoms. These symptoms are highly correlated with membership in the diagnostic category known as schizophrenia. But not every patient with schizophrenia has the entire set of symptoms. The more of these symptoms you have, the more you look like a typical person with schizophrenia. Fewer symptoms, more atypical. But still, what this kind of scheme allows you to do is to diagnose people with one form of mental illness or another while avoiding the problems associated with thinking about the diagnostic categories as proper sets. And this prototype view, fuzzy, if you will, fuzzy set view of categorization, runs throughout the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. It's very clear with respect to schizophrenia. And again, these are so-called secondary features of schizophrenia. If you've got these kinds of features, any 2 of them, okay, that also qualifies you for a diagnosis, but it doesn't matter which 2. So you can have one person with schizophrenia who shows peculiar behavior and odd beliefs, another person with schizophrenia who shows impaired hygiene and has unusual perceptual experiences, hears voices and things like that. All these individuals will be diagnosed as having schizophrenia, but there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity inside this category. So the same thing goes for DSM-5, which just came out last year, exactly the same idea. If you've got 2 or more characteristic symptoms, okay, you can be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Here is the diagnosis for major depressive episode. 5 or more of these symptoms over 2 weeks, but that's a list of 9 symptoms. So any 5 will do to qualify you for a diagnosis of depression. It doesn't have to be some particular set of singly necessary and jointly sufficient features. Same thing for anxiety disorder. Now here, in order to get a diagnosis of anxiety disorder, you got to be anxious. It's a defining feature, right? But that's not sufficient for a diagnosis of anxiety disorder. You've got to show at least 3 of these symptoms as well, and that means that there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity in a group of patients, all carrying the same diagnosis of anxiety disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder, yeah, you've got to have exposure to trauma. If there's not documented exposure to trauma, you can't get that diagnosis. But the other symptoms, you're supposed to show 1 or more symptoms of re-experiencing the trauma, 3 or more symptoms of avoiding the trauma, and 2 or more other kinds of symptoms. But again, aside from this defining feature, exposure to trauma, which makes a great deal of sense, no point in diagnosing somebody with post-traumatic stress disorder unless they've been traumatized. But except for that defining feature, all of these other features are characteristic. They're only probabilistically associated with membership in a particular category. So even here, exposure to trauma is necessary for the diagnosis, but it's not sufficient. Okay? These packages are sufficient for the diagnosis, but none of them are necessary. They're not defining features anymore. You see the same prototype view of classification when we come to another aspect of personality classification, which is classifying behaviors with respect to their psychological implications. So if you see somebody out on the street doing something, you say, oh, you know, that's a very extroverted thing to do, or that's a very neurotic thing to do, or that's a very agreeable thing to do. How do you make that classification? Well, according to the classical view that comes down to us from Aristotle, there'd be a set of features that define what an agreeable behavior is, what a conscientious behavior is. But it turns out not to be the case. David Buss and Ken Craik, Buss was a student here at Berkeley, Ken Craik was an emeritus professor, applied this prototype view to the assessment of personality traits, basically following Rorschach type arguments and said, look, traits are categories of actions. There are kinds of actions we classify as extroverted. There are kinds of actions that we classify as conscientious. They're equivalence classes because they're all kind of extroverted behaviors or they're all kind of conscientious behaviors. But that there was Buss and Craik's insight that these trait labels really just are labels. They're classificatory labels, not necessarily causes of behavior. And they went on to try to figure out how it is that we classify a behavior as extroverted or conscientious or whatever. And they found out that a version of Rorschach's feature prototype view did the trick. So, for example, in one of their studies, they asked people, they set out 6 different categories of acts: agreeable, quarrelsome, dominant, submissive, and asked subjects to list various behaviors that exemplified those personality traits. Then they had another group of subjects rate the prototypicality of those behaviors. That is, how likely is it that a particular behavior would be classified as extroverted or as conscientious or whatever. And what they discovered was that the various kinds of acts that are listed as exemplary of one personality category or another varied in their prototypicality. So, for example, when we come to the category of agreeable behaviors, there are some behaviors that are highly prototypical of agreeableness. Behaviors like readily doing the dishes after dinner. There are others, forgiving acquaintance for spreading a false rumor, that's less typical of agreeable behavior. Picks up the tab for lunch, even less typical. Arrives on time for a meeting, even less typical than that. What Buss and Craik discovered was that even the kinds of behaviors that you encounter in a personality questionnaire, trying to assess a person's personality traits, these vary in prototypicality as well, in that they are differentially correlated with membership in the category. Just to run through a couple of these quickly to give you the idea. For aloofness, okay, here's a highly aloof behavior, offers monosyllabic responses to conversational overture, good, fine, right? You don't get anything else out of him, okay? If you see somebody doing that, you have a very good shot at knowing that they're aloof, or visits museum alone, not. I'm going to just go through this very quickly. This is all in the notes. But the general idea here is that this act frequency model for the classifying behavior is exactly the kind of model that you have if you adopted the Rorschean prototype view of classification. The same idea that holds when we classify social behaviors as holds when we classify people. We look at characteristic features, not defining features. We look at category prototypes, not lists of singly necessary and jointly sufficient features. That's the structure of categories, social categories. I'll have a little bit more to say about this next week, but mostly on Monday we want to talk about a particular kind of social category, social stereotypes, and find out how they're structured internally and how they function cognitively. I'm going to let you go a little bit early because the next class has a midterm exam. Thank you very much. Stay dry and have a good weekend. I'm sorry?
exemplar view of categorization?
Yeah, you'll find, yes, there is an exemplar view. I didn't have time to do it today, but you'll find out more about that in the lecture supplements, and maybe I'll have a chance to talk about it next week. There's not just an exemplar alternative, there's also a theory-based alternative that's quite interesting. Exactly.